The exact moment Nate's fingers closed around Rafael DeSantis' sleeve, every conversation in Ristorante Luminosa died as if someone had severed the building's oxygen supply. The child's hand trembled against imported Italian wool, small enough that his entire palm barely covered the width of the fabric, yet the grip carried desperation that froze 23 armed men in various states of reaching for weapons they couldn't use. Rafael's dinner companion, a property developer negotiating waterfront construction permits, stopped mid-sentence with his wine glass suspended halfway to his lips, face draining of color, as he calculated how proximity to a child disrupting the city's most dangerous man might affect his survival prospects. The corner table occupied prime position with sightlines to every entrance, exit, and potential threat vector in the establishment. The restaurant's interior communicated wealth through deliberate understatement rather than vulgar display. Its exposed brick walls holding paintings acquired from estates whose owners had needed to liquidate assets quickly and quietly. Edison bulbs cast amber light across tables spaced far enough apart that conversations remained private even when voices rose, while the kitchen produced northern Italian cuisine that critics praised, without knowing who signed their paychecks. Nate stood wearing a jacket repaired at the elbows, with fabric that didn't quite match the original material, his jeans clean but worn thin at the knees from playground use, rather than fashionable distressing. His sneakers left faint wet prints on polished hardwood from November rain that had turned streets into rivers of cold water, and his dark hair stuck to his forehead in patterns that suggested he'd been running for blocks. 3 different staff members had attempted to intercept the child before he reached Rafael's table, but Nate had dodged them with determination that overrode every survival instinct a 7-year-old should possess. The maitre d' now stood 15 feet away with his hand pressed against his chest, visibly calculating whether his career would survive this security failure or if he should start updating his resume immediately. Rafael's eyes, dark enough to appear black in the restaurant's deliberately dim lighting, fixed on the child with attention that had made experienced criminals confess to crimes they hadn't committed just to escape that gaze. His posture remained relaxed against leather upholstery custom-made in Florence, but everyone who knew him recognized the stillness that preceded decisions with permanent consequences and irreversible outcomes. The words tumbled from Nate's mouth in a rush that suggested he'd been rehearsing them during his entire journey to this moment, his voice high and clear in the oppressive silence that had consumed the dining room. "Your men hurt my mom all day," he said, the accusation delivered with childhood directness that didn't understand diplomatic phrasing or strategic omission of uncomfortable truths. At surrounding tables, conversations resumed in forced normalcy that fooled no one. Diners suddenly finding their osso buco or pappardelle absolutely fascinating while their peripheral vision remained locked on the unfolding drama. 2 women in designer dresses leaned toward each other with expressions of concern that would have seemed maternal if their eyes hadn't been calculating social media value of witnessing whatever happened next. Rafael's associate stationed near the bar moved his hand away from the concealed weapon at his spine, recognizing that his employer's lack of immediate reaction meant violence was off the table for now. The man had worked for Rafael for 11 years and could read his moods the way meteorologists read pressure systems, predicting storms before the first cloud appeared on the horizon. The developer across from Rafael carefully set his wineglass on the table with precision that suggested he was concentrating very hard on not making sudden movements that might draw attention back to his presence. His breathing had gone shallow enough that his chest barely moved, and sweat beaded along his hairline, despite the restaurant's perfectly calibrated temperature control, maintaining exactly 68 degrees throughout the space. Nate's grip on the sleeve hadn't loosened despite the weight of dozens of eyes on his small frame, his knuckles white with effort and his jaw set in determination that made him look older than his 7 years. The child swayed slightly on his feet, exhaustion evident in the dark circles under his eyes, and the way he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like standing still required more energy than he possessed. Rafael reached for the water glass at his right hand, with movements so controlled they appeared almost mechanical, lifting it to his lips for a sip that bought him 3 seconds to process information. His mind was already categorizing and cross-referencing. His organization operated under strict protocols that made unauthorized action not just forbidden, but unthinkable, which meant this child was either lying or something had gone catastrophically wrong in the chain of command. The kitchen sounds filtering through the swinging doors suddenly seemed amplified in the silence, the clatter of pots and barked instructions in Italian creating strange counterpoint to the frozen tableau in the dining room. A waiter carrying 3 plates of saltimbocca stood motionless near the service station, unable to deliver the food without walking past the corner table, where protocols he didn't understand were being violated. Raphael set his water glass down with the same deliberate care he applied to every gesture, the crystal-based meeting marble tabletop, without producing even a whisper of sound. His focus remained absolute on the child whose fingers still clutched his sleeve, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried no more volume than necessary to reach Nate's ears while somehow filling the entire restaurant with presence that made people stop breathing. "Your name," Raphael said, the two words containing neither threat nor comfort, but simple requirement for information that would determine every action that followed. The question bypassed all the obvious responses he could have given, ignored the breach of protocol and security, and went directly to the foundation of whatever situation had brought a 7-year-old into his world. Nate's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his eyes darting briefly to the exits he'd noticed on his way in with the automatic awareness children developed in unsafe neighborhoods. But his hand didn't release its grip on expensive fabric, and his voice remained steady when he answered with first name only, the single word carrying weight of identity claimed rather than given. The associate near the bar received some signal invisible to everyone else in the room, pulling out his phone with movements that tried for casual, but achieved only tense. He typed rapidly with thumbs that had broken more bones than sent text messages, his expression neutral while his eyes tracked every person who might represent a threat to the unfolding situation nobody had anticipated or prepared for. Raphael's attention shifted to the sleeve Nate still gripped, studying the small hand with its dirt-rimmed fingernails and scraped knuckles that spoke of recent impact with something harder than flesh. The child had been in a confrontation before arriving here, had possibly fought someone or something to reach this restaurant, and the calculation of what kind of desperation drove that level of determination was already reshaping Raphael's evening plans into something entirely different from permit negotiations. The property developer seized the moment of Raphael's divided attention to stand with movements that tried for dignity, but achieved only desperate flight, mumbling something about early meetings and family obligations, while his eyes begged for permission to disappear. Raphael dismissed him with a gesture so slight it barely qualified as acknowledgement. His focus already returned to Nate before the man had taken 3 steps toward the exit. "They came to our building this afternoon," Nate said, the words emerging in careful sequence as if he'd been organizing them in his mind throughout his journey to this moment. The child's free hand gestured vaguely toward what might have been east or northeast, indicating distance he'd traveled on foot through neighborhoods that grew progressively more dangerous, as darkness fell and temperature dropped toward freezing. The men wore uniforms that looked official enough to fool residents who didn't examine details too closely, Nate continued, his voice taking on the precise quality children developed when reciting important information they'd been told to memorize. Badge numbers were visible on their chests, and Nate rattled off 3 sequences of digits without hesitation or doubt. The numbers burned into his memory, with the clarity that came from understanding they might be the only weapon he possessed. "They knocked on our door around 2 o'clock when Mom was trying to sleep before her night shift at the hospital," Nate explained, his narrative gaining momentum as he worked through events he'd clearly replayed in his mind repeatedly. The child described how his mother had answered in her scrubs because she'd fallen asleep in them after her morning shift ended, too exhausted to change before collapsing onto their second-hand couch. The uniformed men had demanded payment for protection services his mother never requested and certainly couldn't afford, their voices loud enough that neighbors had cracked their doors to witness the confrontation before quickly retreating to the safety of their own apartments. Nate's description included specific details about the lead man's scarred knuckles, and the way the second man kept touching a bulge under his jacket that might have been a weapon or might have been intimidation theater. His mother had tried explaining she was a nurse working double shifts to keep their apartment and had no money for additional expenses she hadn't budgeted for or agreed to accept. The men had laughed at her explanation, the sound sharp and cruel in the narrow hallway that smelled like boiled cabbage and industrial cleaning solution, telling her that financial planning wasn't their concern and payment was mandatory regardless of personal circumstances. "They stayed for hours," Nate said, his voice dropping lower as he described how the men had positioned themselves in their small living room, sitting on furniture purchased from thrift stores, and making comments about the lack of anything valuable worth taking. His mother had remained standing the entire time, refusing to sit while they occupied her space, her spine straight despite exhaustion that made her hands tremble. The men had gone through their kitchen cabinets looking for cash his mother might have hidden, opening boxes of generic cereal and bargain pasta with theatrical thoroughness that made clear they enjoyed the invasion more than they cared about finding money. They'd commented on the contents with mockery that cut deeper than threats, observing that people who could only afford store-brand food should probably reconsider their priorities. Nate described watching from his bedroom doorway as his mother had maintained composure that must have cost her everything, answering questions with steady voice, while her fingers twisted the hem of her scrub top into patterns of wrinkles that would need ironing before her next shift. The child had memorized every detail of the men's appearance from his observation point, cataloging information with the survival instinct children developed in environments where adults couldn't always protect them. When his mother had finally convinced the men she genuinely possessed no cash in the apartment, they'd written an amount on a piece of paper and told her they'd return in 1 week, expecting full payment plus interest for making them waste their afternoon. The figure they'd demanded represented more than 2 weeks of her salary, an impossible sum that had made her face go pale beneath the exhaustion bruises under her eyes. After the men left, Nate had watched his mother sink onto the couch with her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent crying that lasted exactly 90 seconds before she'd straightened and started preparing for her night shift, as if nothing had happened. But Nate had seen the way her hands trembled while she tied her shoes, the way she'd checked the locks on their door 3 times before leaving. That's when Nate had made his decision, waiting until his mother left for the hospital, before putting on his repaired jacket and heading out into November cold, with determination that overrode his fear. He'd walked 17 blocks through neighborhoods where children his age shouldn't travel alone, following directions he'd overheard when the men had mentioned reporting back to someone at Ristorante Luminosa. The child had dodged 2 different groups of teenagers who'd eyed him with interest that might have been predatory, or might have been curious concern about why someone so young was alone after dark. He'd kept moving with purpose that made him seem like he belonged wherever he was walking, a psychological trick he'd learned from watching how delivery people moved through their building without being questioned. 3 times Nate had gotten lost and needed to backtrack, using landmarks he'd memorized from the single time his mother had taken him on a bus trip to the nice part of the city for a free museum day. The rain had started during his 4th mile, cold enough to make his breath visible and his fingers numb inside pockets with holes worn through the lining. When he'd finally located Ristorante Luminosa, the warm light spilling from its windows had seemed impossibly bright against the darkness that had fully claimed the streets by then. Nate had stood outside for 5 full minutes gathering courage while his teeth chattered and his sneakers squelched with rainwater that had soaked through the worn fabric. The maitre d' had tried to turn him away with polite dismissal that became firmer when Nate insisted he needed to speak with the owner. But the child had spotted Raphael through the window and recognized him from descriptions he'd heard the uniformed men exchange. Something about the way people positioned themselves around Raphael's table had confirmed what Nate suspected, and he darted past the maitre d' with speed born from playground games where being caught meant losing. Now Nate stood with his hand still gripping expensive sleeve material, having delivered his accusation to the one person who might possess power to fix what had gone wrong in their small apartment that afternoon. The child's breath came faster with each passing second of silence, his courage beginning to crack under the weight of what he'd done and where he'd done it. Raphael's expression had not changed throughout Nate's explanation, but something had shifted in the quality of his stillness, a crystallization of focus that made the temperature in the immediate vicinity of the corner table seem to drop several degrees. His eyes moved to the associate near the bar, and some wordless communication passed between them that sent the man moving toward the restaurant's private office with phone already rising to his ear. The associate returned within 8 minutes, carrying a tablet that he placed on the table beside Raffaele's untouched dinner, its screen displaying information that had been compiled with efficiency that came from years of practice gathering intelligence quickly. Raphael's eyes scanned text and images without his head position changing, processing data while maintaining awareness of everything happening in his peripheral vision, including Nate's slight sway of exhaustion. 3 men operating in the Riverside district, wearing approximations of legitimate collection uniforms. The associate reported in voice pitched low enough that surrounding tables couldn't overhear, despite straining to do exactly that. The description matched multiple complaints filed with local precinct over the past 6 weeks, but no arrests had been made because victims consistently refused to provide testimony or identification when officers followed up on initial reports. Raphael's jaw tightened fractionally, the only external sign of anger that would have sent his inner circle scrambling for cover if they'd been present to witness it. Unauthorized operations using his organization's reputation as shield represented the kind of disrespect that couldn't be tolerated without inviting further erosion of the control structure he'd spent 15 years building through strategic violence and calculated mercy applied in precise measures. The badge numbers Nate had memorized didn't match any legitimate law enforcement issue, the associate continued, but they were close enough to fool civilians who wouldn't know to check for specific formatting details that separated real identification from convincing forgery. The uniforms themselves appeared to be surplus police gear purchased from online auction sites that specialized in selling decommissioned official equipment to security companies and film production warehouses. Surveillance footage from 3 buildings in the Riverside district had been acquired through contacts who owed favors and didn't ask questions about why the footage was needed so urgently. The associate swiped through images on the tablet, showing the same 3 men visiting different apartments over the past month, their body language aggressive and their timing strategic, always arriving during hours when working adults would be home and too tired to mount effective resistance. Gemma Sterling's nursing credentials had been verified through hospital employment records that were easier to access than they should have been, revealing she'd worked at Metropolitan General for 4 years, with spotless performance reviews and excessive overtime hours that painted picture of someone perpetually one emergency away from financial catastrophe. Her apartment lease showed monthly rent that consumed 60% of her base salary before overtime, leaving margins too thin to absorb unexpected expenses like fictional protection payments. The building where Gemma and Nate lived appeared on a list of properties being targeted systematically, the associate explained, indicating someone had done research to identify residents who worked legitimate jobs, but lacked resources to fight back effectively against organized intimidation. The pattern suggested intelligence gathering that preceded operations by weeks, with scouts identifying optimal targets through observation of routines and assessment of vulnerability indicators. Raphael's organization maintained strict protocols about territorial operations, with designated collectors who wore no uniforms and made no threats because their reputation preceded them into every interaction. Protection payments were rendered voluntarily by businesses that valued the stability his organization provided against less predictable criminal elements, and residential buildings were completely off-limits under rules that had been established decades before Raphael assumed leadership. The 3 men running the unauthorized scheme had no official connection to Raphael's organization based on initial database checks, but they'd clearly studied operational patterns well enough to create convincing imitation that exploited his reputation without his knowledge or permission. This represented calculated theft, not just of money from victims, but of the carefully maintained boundaries that kept Raphael's world separate from civilians who deserved to live without fear of criminal interference. 2 of the 3 men had been identified through facial recognition, cross-referenced with arrest records from neighboring jurisdictions, revealing histories of minor racketeering and protection scheme convictions that had resulted in minimal jail time before they'd apparently relocated and upgraded their operations. The 3rd man remained unidentified in official databases, but building security footage showed he drove a vehicle registered to an address in Queens that was flagged as known associate residence for mid-level criminal operations. Raphael lifted one finger from the table in gesture so minimal it barely qualified as movement, but it sent the associate back toward the office to make additional calls that would set larger machinery in motion. Around the restaurant, the ambient noise level had risen to normal conversational volume, as guests realized they wouldn't witness immediate violence, and returned their attention to meals that were growing cold on expensive china. Nate's grip on Raphael's sleeve had finally loosened during the associate's report, the child's arm dropping to his side as exhaustion overwhelmed the adrenaline that had sustained him through his 17-block journey and confrontation with the most dangerous man in the city. His eyelids drooped with fatigue that 7-year-olds couldn't fight indefinitely regardless of how urgent their mission felt. The maitre d' approached the table with hesitation that made his normally fluid movements awkward and uncertain, his hands clasped before him in posture that begged forgiveness for the security breach that had allowed a child to penetrate defenses designed to prevent exactly this kind of disruption. Raphael ignored him completely, his attention fixed on Nate with focus that had shifted from assessment to decision, calculation complete, and course of action determined. A waiter appeared with menu Raphael hadn't requested, placing it on the table within Nate's line of sight, while maintaining careful distance as if the child might be contagious with some disorder that afflicted people who grabbed mafia bosses without permission. The menu featured dishes with Italian names and English descriptions, prices absent, because establishments like this operated on the principle that if you needed to ask cost, you didn't belong in the dining room. Raphael gestured to the chair his dinner companion had vacated, indicating Nate should sit with economy of movement that made the invitation simultaneously welcoming and non-negotiable. The child hesitated for 3 seconds before climbing onto leather upholstery that was probably worth more than every piece of furniture in his apartment combined, his feet dangling several inches above the floor because the chairs had been sized for adults who conducted business over meals that lasted hours. "When did you last eat?" Raphael asked, the question emerging in tone that suggested he already knew the answer, but required confirmation before proceeding with whatever plan was forming behind eyes that revealed nothing about the calculations happening in his mind. His hand moved to catch a passing waiter's attention, summoning him to the table with gesture that brought immediate compliance and anxious hovering. Nate's face flushed with embarrassment that made him look even younger than his 7 years, his gaze dropping to the white tablecloth as he admitted he'd had breakfast at school that morning, but nothing since because his mother had told him to save the food in their apartment for later in the week, when her paycheck would be stretched even thinner than usual. The child's stomach chose that moment to produce audible growl that carried in the relative quiet surrounding their table. Raphael ordered in Italian rapid enough that Nate couldn't follow even if he'd understood the language, his instructions specific, and delivered with authority that had the waiter nodding repeatedly, before hurrying toward the kitchen with obvious relief at having clear direction in situation that had no protocol or precedent. Within 3 minutes the first plate arrived, focaccia bread still warm from the oven with olive oil and herbs that made the entire corner of the restaurant smell like Mediterranean summer. The child stared at the food with expression that cycled through hunger, suspicion, and uncertainty about whether accepting anything from this man represented betrayal of some principle his mother had tried to instill about not taking things from strangers. But the bread's aroma defeated whatever reservations Nate harbored, and his hand reached for a piece with tentative motion that became decisive once his fingers touched crust that crackled under gentle pressure. The warehouse stood 3 blocks from the waterfront, in a district where legitimate businesses closed by 6, and questioned nothing that happened after dark. Its exterior marked only by faded numbers on rusted metal siding that hadn't seen fresh paint in 2 decades. Raphael's vehicle pulled into the loading bay at 11:47, its headlights cutting through darkness thick enough to feel solid against the windshield, before cutting out and leaving only distant streetlights to define the space. Inside the cavernous interior, industrial fixtures cast pools of harsh light that left shadows deep enough to hide anything that didn't want to be seen, the concrete floor stained with substances that could have been motor oil or could have been something organic that had dried decades ago. 3 men knelt in the center of the largest illuminated area, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, and their faces showing various stages of understanding that their situation had moved beyond salvageable into territory where survival became the only negotiable outcome. The lead man with scarred knuckles Nate had described wore his fake uniform with several buttons missing, likely torn off during the collection process that had brought him to this warehouse against his will and without the courtesy of explanation. His eyes tracked Raphael's approach with calculation that suggested he was still trying to identify an angle he could work, some leverage he could apply to transform his circumstances from terminal to merely catastrophic. 2 of Raphael's actual enforcers stood behind the kneeling men, with postures that communicated boredom rather than anticipation, their presence purely functional rather than theatrical, because violence in this organization was business decision rather than entertainment. The younger of the 2 had worked collections for 6 years and had never once needed to escalate beyond verbal communication, because reputation preceded him so thoroughly that resistance never materialized into anything requiring physical response. Raphael stopped 15 feet from the kneeling men, close enough that they could see his face clearly, but far enough that they couldn't reach him, even if their hands had been free, and they'd been foolish enough to try. His silence extended for 43 seconds, a calculated pause that forced the men to fill the void with their own imaginations of what would happen next, fear growing exponentially with each moment that passed without spoken threat or explanation. "You've been collecting money in my name," Raphael finally said, his voice carrying no more volume than necessary to reach the kneeling men, but somehow filling the entire warehouse with presence that made the temperature feel like it had dropped 10 degrees. The statement wasn't accusation requiring confirmation, but fact being acknowledged before consequences were distributed. According to protocols, these men should have researched before attempting their scheme. The lead man opened his mouth to offer explanation or excuse, but Raphael's raised hand cut off the words before they could form into coherent defense. Whatever story had been prepared during the collection process and transport to this warehouse became irrelevant before it could be delivered, because explanations only mattered when someone with power cared about motivations, rather than simply addressing outcomes. Every family you visited will receive double what you took from them, Raphael continued, his tone suggesting he was discussing weather patterns rather than financial restitution that would total well into 5 figures depending on how many victims these men had accumulated during their unauthorized operation. The money will arrive tomorrow morning in unmarked envelopes with apologies for the inconvenience and assurance that such visits won't occur again under any circumstances. The second man, younger and less experienced than his scarred companion, made sound between whimper and protest that died in his throat when one of the enforcers shifted weight from one foot to the other. The minimal movement contained no explicit threat, but communicated volumes about how quickly cooperation could deteriorate into something far less comfortable than kneeling on cold concrete with zip-tied wrists. "You'll return every dollar you collected to my associate within the next 6 hours, Raphael said, his gaze moving between the 3 men with attention that suggested he was cataloging details he might need to recall later if circumstances required follow-up intervention. "Whatever you've already spent, you'll borrow from family, friends, or loan sharks. But the full amount will be delivered before sunrise, or you'll discover why people who actually work for me never require second warnings." The men would also provide complete lists of every residence they'd visited and every person they'd threatened, Raphael continued, the instruction delivered with expectation of immediate compliance, because alternatives weren't being offered for consideration. His organization would verify the accuracy of these lists through independent investigation, and any omissions would be interpreted as continued disrespect, requiring escalated response that wouldn't include additional opportunities for voluntary cooperation. Furthermore, the 3 men would leave the city by noon tomorrow and wouldn't return for any reason short of terminal medical emergencies requiring specialized treatment unavailable elsewhere. Their families could remain or relocate according to personal preference, but the men themselves had forfeited rights to conduct any business within city limits through actions that had demonstrated catastrophically poor judgment about whose reputation could be borrowed without permission. The fake uniforms would be destroyed immediately, and any documentation suggesting official authority would be surrendered to Raphael's associate before the men left this warehouse in whatever condition their cooperation earned them. Photographs of their faces would be distributed to every criminal organization operating within 100-mile radius, with notation that they were forbidden from employment in any capacity that involved collections, protection, or interaction with civilian populations. The lead man's calculation finally reached conclusion that survival required complete capitulation, and he nodded with movement that made his neck tendons stand out like cables under skin stretched too tight across skull. His voice emerged hoarse when he agreed to every condition Raphael had outlined, the words tumbling over each other in eagerness to demonstrate compliance before patience ran out, and consequences became physical, rather than merely financial and geographical. Raphael studied the men for 10 additional seconds, his expression revealing nothing about whether their agreement satisfied requirements or merely delayed more permanent solutions to the problem they represented. The warehouse silence felt heavy enough to have physical weight, pressing down on the kneeling men until their shoulders curved forward under pressure that existed only in their perception of how close they'd come to outcomes that didn't include walking out of this building. One of the enforcers produced knife from pocket, moving to cut the zip ties with efficiency that suggested he'd performed this exact action hundreds of times in various contexts, ranging from mercy to prelude for different kinds of restraints. The 3 men rubbed their wrists where plastic had cut into skin, leaving red marks that would fade within days, unlike the memory of this encounter which would persist indefinitely. "You have 6 hours, Raphael reminded them, his tone unchanged from the almost conversational quality he'd maintained throughout the entire interaction, despite discussing matters that could have justified violence these men had surely anticipated. "His associate will provide location for money delivery and collection of your detailed lists. I suggest you start making phone calls to arrange the funds you'll need to fulfill your obligations before the deadline passes." The men scrambled to their feet with movements that lacked any dignity or coordination, their legs stiff from kneeling and their balance uncertain as adrenaline that had sustained them began to metabolize into trembling that would intensify once they reached safety and their bodies recognized they'd survived. They moved toward the warehouse exit with pace that wanted to become running, but maintained enough control to avoid triggering predatory instincts that chasing might activate. Raphael remained motionless until the warehouse door closed behind the departing men, and engine sounds faded into urban night noise of distant traffic and industrial equipment, humming in facilities that operated around the clock. His jaw unclenched fractionally, releasing tension that hadn't been visible until its absence made clear how much control he'd been exercising over impulses that would have been easier to satisfy than suppress. The younger enforcer asked if they should maintain surveillance on the men to ensure compliance with relocation orders, his question phrased with deference that acknowledged he was suggesting rather than presuming to advise someone whose strategic thinking operated several levels beyond what immediate circumstances revealed. Raphael nodded once, authorization given without need for elaboration, because competent people understood implications without requiring detailed instructions. Metropolitan General Hospital occupied 12 floors of functional architecture, designed in an era when medical facilities prioritized efficiency over aesthetics, its exterior notable only for emergency entrance lit with red glow, visible for blocks in every direction. Raphael's vehicle stopped in visitor parking, rather than the circular drive where valets collected luxury cars belonging to administrators and surgeons who could afford such services. His choice of entrance deliberate to avoid unnecessary attention from staff who might question his presence. The lobby smelled like industrial disinfectant layered over something organic that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate, fluorescent lights casting harsh illumination that made everyone look slightly ill, regardless of their actual health status. A directory near the elevator bank listed departments in alphabetical order, and Raphael's eyes found nursing administration on the 4th floor without needing to search through the complete list. He rode the elevator with a tired couple holding hands, and a young man in scrubs who looked like he hadn't slept in 30 hours. The shared space filled with silence broken only by mechanical sounds of cables and pulleys moving the car between floors. Nobody made eye contact because hospitals stripped away social niceties and left only raw humanity focused on survival and recovery and the exhausting work of caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. The 4th floor hallway stretched in both directions from the elevator, its walls decorated with mandatory safety posters and employee recognition boards displaying photographs of nurses whose service anniversaries warranted acknowledgement. Raphael walked toward the administrative office, following signs that assumed visitors possessed basic literacy and sense of direction, his shoes silent on linoleum that showed wear patterns revealing decades of foot traffic along the same routes. The office contained 2 desks, separated by low partition that provided illusion of privacy without actual sound barrier, and behind the right desk sat a woman in her 50s, whose name tag identified her as the scheduling coordinator. She looked up from her computer screen with expression that cycled from professional courtesy to recognition to carefully controlled neutrality as she processed who had entered her workspace, and began calculating whether his presence represented problems she could handle or needed to escalate immediately. Gemma Sterling's shift schedule appeared on a clipboard hanging from the partition, visible to anyone who cared to look closely enough to read names and assigned floors, and times that determined when nurses would be available for patient care versus personal concerns. Raphael's eyes found her name in the 3rd position from the top, noting she was scheduled for the night shift that would begin in 47 minutes on the 7th floor oncology unit. "I need to speak with Gemma Sterling briefly before her shift begins," Raphael said, his tone carrying no threat, but also no uncertainty about whether his request would be accommodated or rejected based on hospital policy about visitors in employee areas. The coordinator's hands froze above her keyboard for 2 seconds before resuming their position, fingers not quite touching keys, while she processed how to respond to situation outside her experience, and probably outside her training. "She's in the staff lounge preparing for her shift," the coordinator finally answered, her voice steady despite obvious internal debate about whether facilitating this conversation was wise or would later be cited as catastrophic error in judgment. "The lounge is down the hall, 3rd door on the left, but I should inform you that staff areas are technically restricted to employees and authorized personnel with specific clearance from administration." Raphael nodded acknowledgement of the policy, without indicating whether he intended to respect it, leaving the coordinator to wrestle with decision about whether to call security or pretend she'd done her job by stating the rules and assume whatever happened next was beyond her pay grade. He moved back into the hallway before she could resolve her internal conflict, walking toward the 3rd door with confidence that suggested he knew exactly where he was going, regardless of authorization status. The staff lounge was small and utilitarian, containing microwave that smelled like burned popcorn, refrigerator covered with passive-aggressive notes about labeled food and cleaning schedules, and collection of mismatched chairs surrounding table scarred with coffee rings and pen marks from frustrated nurses doing paperwork between crises. Gemma sat alone in the corner chair with her back to the wall, eating sandwich from plastic container while reading something on her phone with focus that suggested she was trying to retain information before 12-hour shift consumed her ability to concentrate on anything beyond immediate patient needs. She looked up when Raphael entered, her expression shifting from mild irritation at interruption to shock that made her hand freeze halfway to her mouth with sandwich suspended in space. The phone nearly slipped from her other hand before she caught it, setting both items on the table with movements that seemed to require conscious effort as her brain processed his presence in space she'd believed was safe from the world that had invaded her apartment days earlier. Her first words were about Nate, the question emerging sharp with maternal fear that overrode any concern about her own safety or the strangeness of this conversation happening in hospital staff lounge rather than somewhere his presence would make more sense. Raphael raised both hands in gesture meant to communicate reassurance, explaining the child was safe and currently under supervision of his associate, who was feeding him dinner that would probably constitute the best meal Nate had consumed in months, if not years. Gemma's shoulders dropped fractionally as fear transformed into different emotion that might have been relief mixed with residual anger about circumstances that had sent her 7-year-old on dangerous journey through city streets to find help she hadn't known how to request. Her eyes held questions she didn't ask because nurses developed skill at reading situations quickly and understanding when explanations would come in their own time, versus when pushing for information would shut down communication entirely. Raphael explained the situation with the 3 men in sentences stripped of unnecessary detail, but containing enough information that Gemma could understand the threat had been neutralized permanently rather than merely postponed. He described the restitution that would arrive by morning and the geographical relocation that would ensure the men never returned to cause additional problems for her or any other residents in her building. The money isn't charity, he clarified, when Gemma's expression shifted towards something that might have been insulted pride or discomfort at accepting anything from someone whose world she'd been taught to fear and avoid. It's returning what was stolen under false pretenses using my organization's reputation as weapon without authorization. You're entitled to every dollar they took plus additional compensation for the time they stole and the fear they caused through fraudulent claims of authority they didn't possess. Gemma studied him with attention that felt clinical. Her nurse's assessment skills turned toward evaluating someone she couldn't categorize using familiar frameworks of good or bad, dangerous or safe, threat or ally. Her fingers drummed once against the table surface before going still, a nervous gesture caught and controlled, before it could reveal too much about her internal state of confusion regarding man who'd rescued her son and resolved her problem, but whose business model was built on structure she'd spent her life avoiding. She asked why he'd helped them when Nate was just one child among thousands in the city, who probably needed intervention from adults with power to change circumstances beyond what social services could address. The question emerged without accusation, but with genuine curiosity about motivations that didn't fit patterns she'd learned to recognize in people who operated outside legal boundaries, society established to protect vulnerable populations. Because children shouldn't have to fight battles their parents can't win, Raphael answered, his response containing no elaboration or justification beyond the simple statement that apparently he considered sufficient explanation. His eyes moved toward the window overlooking parking lot, where his vehicle waited with associate who was presumably still feeding Nate, and possibly questioning life choices that had resulted in unexpected babysitting duties. Gemma's expression softened marginally, recognition passing across her features that suggested she'd just understood something about the man standing in her break room that hadn't been obvious from circumstances of their meeting. She thanked him with words that sounded formal and inadequate for the intervention he'd provided, but her voice carried sincerity that transformed the simple phrase into acknowledgement of debt she couldn't repay with money or favors. He mentioned that his associate would drive her and Nate home after her shift ended, the offer delivered as statement of fact rather than suggestion open to negotiation or refusal. The city wasn't safe for nurse leaving hospital at 2 a.m. to walk to bus stop in November cold, and his vehicle would be significantly more comfortable than public transportation that would require 2 transfers and expose her to populations that weren't all as harmless as they needed to be at that hour. Gemma opened her mouth to decline automatically, but Raphael was already moving toward the door before she could voice objection that would have been rooted in principle rather than practical consideration of her actual safety. She watched him leave with expression that suggested she was reassessing every assumption she'd held about categories of people, and whether those boundaries were as clear as she'd been taught to believe during sheltered upbringing that hadn't prepared her for complexity of moral choices in a world where good and evil weren't distributed along predictable lines. The first morning after the envelope arrived, Gemma woke at 4:30 despite having nowhere to be until her evening shift, her body rejecting sleep with adrenaline that belonged to crisis already resolved, but hadn't yet received message that emergency had passed. She lay in darkness listening to Nate's breathing from the adjacent room, processing events of the previous days with mind that kept trying to reorganize them into narrative that made sense according to rules she'd always believed governed how the world functioned. The envelope sat on her kitchen counter where she'd left it, after counting the money 3 times, to confirm the amount was real, and not hallucination brought on by exhaustion or wishful thinking. Double what the fake collectors had taken, plus the type note explaining the situation with clinical precision that somehow made the gesture feel less like charity and more like correction of accounting error in Universe's ledger of debts and obligations. She made coffee with hands that trembled slightly, the physical manifestation of emotional processing her conscious mind was still working through layer by layer. The apartment felt different in ways she couldn't articulate, as if the walls themselves had absorbed some of the security that came from knowing someone with actual power had intervened on her behalf when every system designed to protect people like her had failed or been unavailable, or simply didn't care enough to act. Gemma pulled out her laptop and searched Raphael's name against her better judgment, finding articles that painted picture of man whose business operations existed in gray areas where legal and illegal blurred into something the writers couldn't quite categorize definitively. The property holdings, the restaurant investments, the charitable donations to organizations that served populations most people preferred to ignore, all of it suggested complexity that couldn't be reduced to simple villain narratives she'd been conditioned to apply to people in his profession. Her phone showed 17 unread messages in the building's tenant group chat, conversations she'd been ignoring during her shifts, but now scrolled through with growing awareness that she wasn't the only resident who'd received unexpected envelope. Mrs. Chen had posted cryptic thanks to anonymous benefactor who'd resolved situation none of them had known how to address, and 3 other tenants had responded with similar gratitude wrapped in careful language that avoided specifics. The superintendent had contributed message about how neighborhood felt safer recently, his observation generating agreement from residents who'd noticed same atmospheric shift Gemma had registered, but hadn't wanted to name, for fear of jinxing whatever protection had materialized. Someone mentioned the teenagers who used to loiter near the entrance had relocated, and another resident noted the working girls had moved their operations to different corner, changes that individually seemed minor, but collectively transformed daily experience of leaving and entering the building. Nate emerged from his bedroom at 6:15, earlier than usual for weekend morning, his hair sticking up in patterns that suggested restless sleep, despite his claims the previous night that he was fine and didn't need to talk about what had happened. He climbed onto the chair across from Gemma without speaking, his eyes finding the envelope on the counter, and then moving to his mother's face with expression that asked questions he didn't have words to formulate clearly. She explained as best she could that the man from the restaurant had made sure the bad situation was fixed, and they didn't need to worry anymore about men demanding money they didn't have. Nate absorbed this information with 7-year-old's acceptance of adult explanations that didn't quite make sense but came from trusted source. His follow-up question about whether they could visit the restaurant again, revealing where his priorities had settled after processing his own version of recent events. The bread was really good, Nate added with emphasis that suggested this was important detail in his assessment of Raphael's character, and Gemma found herself smiling, despite the complexity of emotions she was wrestling with regarding man who'd solved their problem through methods she probably didn't want to understand too clearly. Her son's ability to reduce complicated moral situations to simple questions about kindness and good food felt simultaneously naive and somehow wiser than her own tendency to overcomplicate everything through excessive analysis. They spent Saturday morning in careful normalcy, Gemma making pancakes while Nate worked on homework he'd neglected during the week's disruptions, both of them performing routine that felt precious, precisely because it had been threatened by circumstances beyond their control. The apartment's familiar sounds, the traffic noise from the street, the neighbor's television through thin walls, all of it created symphony of ordinary life that Gemma had never fully appreciated until facing possibility of losing it. Around 10:30, her phone buzzed with message from unknown number, and Gemma's stomach flipped before she even opened it, because somehow she knew who it was before confirmation appeared on screen. Simple question asking if she and Nate were okay, the words carrying more weight than their surface simplicity suggested, because they represented continued attention from someone who had no obligation to maintain concern beyond resolution of immediate crisis. She typed response 3 times before settling on honest thank you that acknowledged both the question and the larger intervention it represented, her fingers hovering over send button while she debated whether responding would encourage continued contact. She wasn't sure she wanted, despite definitely wanting it in ways that confused her. The message sent before she could overthink further, and his reply came within 2 minutes, single word good that somehow contained more warmth than longer message would have conveyed. Nate's school had called Friday afternoon while she'd been sleeping, the principal's voice on the message asking her to schedule conference to discuss incident where Nate had apparently told his classmates about confronting dangerous man in restaurant to save his mother. The teacher was concerned about whether the story represented truth requiring intervention, or fantasy suggesting processing problems, and could Gemma please call back to clarify the situation and coordinate appropriate response. Gemma returned the call during Nate's cartoon time, explaining carefully edited version of events that included enough truth to satisfy the school's concerns, while omitting details that would trigger mandatory reporting requirements or generate questions she couldn't answer without revealing more than was wise. The principal had accepted her explanation with relief evident in her voice, clearly preferring resolution that didn't require involving authorities or social services in situation that sounded complicated, but appeared to be adequately addressed. Monday morning brought Nate's return to school with backpack that felt heavier than usual, despite containing same books and supplies he always carried, the weight existing in his awareness of story he'd tell when classmates inevitably asked about the adventure he'd mentioned Friday. Gemma had coached him on what details to share and which to keep private, her instructions delivered with seriousness that made Nate understand this wasn't normal parental concern, but something more important requiring his cooperation and discretion. She walked him to the building entrance instead of watching from the apartment window like usual, her need to see him safely inside overriding her normal morning routine that prioritized efficiency over sentiment. Nate had hugged her with unexpected fierceness before running to join his friends, and Gemma stood watching until he disappeared into the building, her chest tight with emotion she couldn't fully name but recognized as some combination of relief and residual fear and gratitude that her son was safe and unharmed by circumstances that could have ended very differently. Her shift that evening brought unexpected visit from hospital administrator, who stopped by the oncology floor ostensibly to check on patient care quality, but spent more time asking about Gemma's well-being with specificity that suggested he knew more about her recent situation than she'd shared with anyone at work. His attention felt simultaneously intrusive and oddly comforting, recognition that somehow information had traveled through channels she didn't understand to reach people with authority to ensure her employment remained secure despite any disruptions her personal life might have caused. The nurse manager pulled her aside during break, with expression that combined concern and curiosity, asking directly if everything was okay at home because several staff members had noticed she seemed distracted lately. Gemma deflected with partial truths about resolved housing issue and stress that was diminishing now that the problem had been addressed, her explanations vague enough to discourage follow-up questions, while specific enough to satisfy immediate concern about her ability to perform job duties safely. Her co-workers treated her differently in ways so subtle she might have imagined them, except the pattern was consistent enough to suggest something had changed in how they perceived her position within the hospital's social hierarchy. The charge nurse, who usually ignored her suggestions, suddenly solicited her opinion on patient care decisions, and the resident who'd been dismissive of nursing input now listened when she raised concerns about medication orders that seemed potentially dangerous. Wednesday brought discovery that her car, which had been making concerning noises for 3 weeks, had been serviced overnight while parked in her building's lot. A note on the windshield explaining the mechanic had been in the area and noticed the issue, and hoped she didn't mind that he'd taken care of the problem. The invoice was marked paid in full with no indication of who had arranged the repair, but Gemma knew exactly whose attention had extended to details she hadn't mentioned needing help with, because she'd trained herself not to ask for assistance she couldn't repay. The realization that Raphael was monitoring aspects of her life closely enough to identify problems before she requested help should have felt invasive or controlling, but instead created strange sense of security she'd never experienced even during her marriage to Nate's father, who'd been too absorbed in his own struggles to notice when she was drowning. The attention felt like being seen in ways she'd forgotten were possible, and processing that feeling required acknowledging desires for partnership she'd convinced herself she'd outgrown after her divorce finalized, and she'd committed to independence as permanent state rather than temporary necessity. Thursday evening brought second envelope, thinner than the first, and containing only handwritten note on expensive stationery that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. The message was brief, explaining that the building's landlord had been encouraged to address deferred maintenance issues that had been making residents' lives unnecessarily difficult, and improvements would begin the following week, starting with heating system that barely functioned and plumbing that regularly backed up into ground floor apartments. Gemma sat with the note for 20 minutes, reading the few sentences repeatedly while trying to understand what kind of man solved problems for people he barely knew and expected nothing in return except perhaps acknowledgement that he'd acted. The gesture went beyond restitution for the fake collector's harassment, extending into territory that looked like genuine care for her well-being, and by extension the well-being of everyone in her building who suffered from landlord's negligence. The week concluded with Gemma standing at her apartment window Friday night, watching street below where life continued in patterns that looked unchanged from external perspective, but felt fundamentally different to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The security she felt wasn't about absence of danger, which still existed throughout the city in forms both random and targeted, but about knowledge that someone was paying attention and had demonstrated willingness to intervene when intervention could prevent suffering she'd been taught to accept as inevitable cost of existing in her economic bracket. Nate appeared beside her at the window, his small hand finding hers with ease born from 7 years of physical affection that remained uncomplicated by the complexities filling her mind. He asked if she was thinking about the man from the restaurant, the question delivered with child's directness that didn't allow for evasion or deflection, and Gemma found herself answering honestly that yes, she was thinking about him, and trying to understand what his continued attention meant for their future. Her son's response was characteristically simple, observing that the man had helped them when they needed help, and had been nice even though he was scary, and wasn't that what good people did regardless of their jobs or reputations? The 7-year-old logic contained wisdom that Gemma's adult complications kept obscuring, and she squeezed his hand while acknowledging internally that maybe moral categories weren't as fixed as she'd always believed, when actual experience kept contradicting theoretical frameworks she'd inherited without examining too closely. 3 weeks passed with the kind of ordinary routine that made previous crisis feel like nightmare Gemma had possibly imagined during stress-induced exhaustion, rather than actual events that had occurred in objective reality. The restitution envelope had arrived exactly as promised, containing double what the fake collectors had taken, plus typed note explaining the situation had been addressed, and wouldn't recur under any circumstances requiring her further concern or action. Nate returned to school with stories about the fancy restaurant and the car with seats that heated themselves and the man who'd listened when adults were supposed to dismiss children as unreliable narrators of their own experiences. His teacher had called Gemma with gentle concern about whether something had happened at home that she should be aware of, whether the family needed resources that the school could help coordinate through social services or community organizations. Gemma had deflected with partial truths about resolved misunderstanding and one-time assistance from someone who'd wanted to help, her explanations vague enough to avoid triggering mandatory reporting requirements, while specific enough to satisfy the teacher's concern that Nate wasn't inventing elaborate fantasies as coping mechanism for trauma he couldn't process through normal developmental channels available to 7-year-olds. The building's elderly superintendent had mentioned that several other residents had received similar envelopes, his observation delivered with raised eyebrow and meaningful pause that invited explanation Gemma didn't provide. She'd simply nodded and changed subject to the leaking pipe in her bathroom that needed attention before water damage became expensive problem neither she nor the landlord wanted to address through insurance claims and contractor negotiations. Her bank balance showed cushion she hadn't possessed in the 4 years since she'd moved to the city for nursing position that paid marginally better than rural hospital where she'd trained, but required cost of living adjustments that consumed any financial advantage the salary increase should have provided. She paid down credit card debt that had accumulated from medical emergency the previous winter, when Nate had needed antibiotics that weren't covered by her insurance formulary, and she'd chosen medicine over groceries for a week. The neighborhood felt different in ways Gemma couldn't articulate without sounding paranoid or delusional, but street-level changes were observable if she paid attention during her walks to and from bus stops. Teenagers who'd previously loitered near her building's entrance had relocated their gatherings to different corner 3 blocks away, and the working girls who'd occupied the alley beside the bodega had shifted their territory toward the avenue where foot traffic was heavier, but police presence was also more consistent. Gemma's co-workers noticed something had changed about her demeanor, even if they couldn't identify the specific transformation, commenting that she seemed less constantly on edge during shifts that required impossible level of alertness sustained for 12 uninterrupted hours. She deflected their observations with explanations about better sleep and new vitamins, Lies that were easier than attempting to describe how security felt when it arrived from source she'd been taught to fear more than the chaos it replaced. Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door had knocked 3 days after the envelope arrived, bringing container of homemade dumplings and casual mention that the building felt safer recently, even though nothing specific had changed that she could point to as evidence for her perception. She'd stayed for tea that neither of them really wanted, the visit clearly serving purpose beyond dumpling delivery and requiring acknowledgement of shared experience neither woman could explicitly reference. Gemma discovered anonymous payment of her elderly neighbor's overdue medical bills when the old man had mentioned in passing that the hospital had written off his balance, and he didn't understand why, but wasn't questioning mercy when it appeared without strings requiring his comprehension. She'd felt something twist in her chest at the recognition that Raffaele's intervention had extended beyond her immediate crisis to address vulnerabilities he had no obligation to notice or reason to care about, beyond basic human decency that shouldn't exist in men who ran criminal organizations. Her parents called from upstate with their monthly check-in that always felt like interrogation disguised as concern, and Gemma found herself editing her responses more carefully than usual to avoid mentioning events that would trigger their insistence she quit her job and move back home where life was safe and suffocating in equal measure. She described Nate's improving grades and her recent extra shifts with enthusiasm that wasn't entirely fabricated, because financial stability changed everything about how she experienced daily existence. The hospital administrator had stopped by the oncology floor to personally thank Gemma for her work during difficult case that had resolved better than expected outcomes would have predicted, his attention unusual enough that her colleagues had speculated afterward about whether she was being considered for promotion to charge nurse position. Gemma knew the administrator's visit had nothing to do with her clinical skills, and everything to do with someone making quiet suggestion that her contributions deserved recognition, but she couldn't prove the connection without sounding delusional about her own importance. She found herself looking for Raphael in places he had no reason to be, her eyes scanning crowds at the grocery store, and faces in vehicles stopped at intersections during her bus commutes. The awareness embarrassed her because she was 31 years old, and should have outgrown the tendency to fixate on people who'd performed single act of kindness, as if that gesture erased everything else about their character and choices, and the systems they perpetuated through their very existence. Nate asked twice if they could go back to the fancy restaurant, his questions casual but persistent, in the way children expressed desires they suspected would be denied if they pushed too hard or made too big a deal about wanting something beyond what their family's circumstances could accommodate. Gemma had explained gently that restaurants like that were special occasion places, not somewhere they could visit regularly. Her answer true but incomplete, because it avoided mentioning the real reason they wouldn't return was that she didn't trust herself around man who'd helped them. Her dreams had begun featuring Raphael in scenarios that made no sense, domestic scenes where he existed in her world rather than she in his. Conversations about ordinary topics like school supplies and grocery prices that would never occur between people whose lives intersected only through crisis intervention. She woke from these dreams disoriented and vaguely guilty about desires her subconscious was processing, without her conscious permission or participation. The third week ended with discovery that someone had anonymously paid 6 months advance rent on her apartment directly to the landlord, the payment arriving with typed note, explaining it was compensation for inconvenience the unauthorized collectors had caused and shouldn't be considered charity requiring gratitude or reciprocation. Gemma had sat on her second-hand couch staring at the landlord's text message confirming the payment until Nate had asked if she was okay, and she'd realized tears were running down her face. She'd spent 20 minutes composing and deleting text message to phone number she didn't have, an email address she'd never received. Her fingers hovering over the keyboard, with words that wouldn't form into coherent expression of what she felt about man who was solving her problems while maintaining careful distance that should have felt respectful, but instead felt like rejection of something either of them had acknowledged existed. The fourth week began with Gemma standing outside Ristorante Luminosa after her shift ended, staring at its lit windows while November wind cut through her scrubs and jacket that wasn't warm enough for the dropping temperature. She stood there for 11 minutes before walking away without entering, her courage insufficient for the conversation she wanted to have but couldn't justify needing, with man whose business card she didn't possess and whose world she'd been taught to avoid for reasons that seemed increasingly less clear with each passing day. Her phone buzzed with text from unknown number containing single sentence asking if she'd made it home safely, and Gemma realized that someone had been watching her stand outside the restaurant from location she couldn't identify, despite scanning the street for obvious surveillance. She typed yes, and then deleted it. Typed thank you and deleted that too. Finally settling on simple acknowledgement that confirmed receipt, without encouraging further communication, that would complicate situation already too complex for her to navigate using familiar moral frameworks. The unknown number responded with a single word goodnight that somehow contained more intimacy than longer message would have conveyed, and Gemma saved the number to her contacts with names she'd probably never use to actually initiate conversation, but wanted to preserve in case future circumstances required direct communication. She fell asleep with phone still clutched in her hand, her apartment warm and secure, in ways that had nothing to do with the working radiator, and everything to do with knowledge that someone was paying attention to her safety from distance, that felt simultaneously comforting and devastating. The elementary school occupied a block in a neighborhood that existed in perpetual state between gentrification and decay, its playground equipment showing rust, despite recent attempts to paint over deterioration with bright colors that fooled nobody. Raphael's vehicle idled 3 spaces down from the main entrance, where parents gathered in clusters defined by income brackets, visible through clothing choices and vehicle quality, the social stratification of American childhood education playing out in real time during afternoon pickup routine. He hadn't planned to be in this neighborhood at 2:45 on a Tuesday afternoon, but business meeting with property owner had concluded earlier than scheduled, and the route back to his office passed the school where Nate attended 3rd grade. The coincidence felt manufactured even to Raphael, who'd built career on understanding when circumstances were genuinely random versus when they'd been unconsciously orchestrated by desires he didn't want to examine too closely or acknowledge too directly. Gemma emerged from the school entrance 7 minutes before the bell would release students, her scrubs visible beneath coat that was warmer than the jacket she'd worn during November, but still inadequate for December cold that had arrived with vindictive intensity. She carried canvas bag that probably contained her work shoes and whatever meal she'd pack for the night shift that would begin 4 hours after she got Nate settled at home with homework and dinner. Her posture showed exhaustion that 12-hour shifts accumulated into permanent condition rather than temporary state, but something about the way she held her head suggested the crushing weight had lightened fractionally since their last encounter. She scanned the waiting parents with practiced efficiency, locating the cluster of other working mothers whose schedules required strategic coordination to manage pickup times that didn't align perfectly with shift changes. Raphael watched her notice his vehicle with double-take that would have been comical if the emotion that crossed her face hadn't been so complex, cycling through surprise and wariness, and something that might have been pleasure before settling into careful neutrality. She glanced at the school entrance and then at his car, calculating whether she had time to cross the distance and have conversation before students poured out, and Nate appeared requiring her attention. The decision resolved in favor of approach, and Gemma walked toward his vehicle with deliberate pace that suggested she was giving herself time to prepare whatever she intended to say. Raphael lowered the passenger window before she reached the car, the gesture both invitation and acknowledgement that he'd been waiting specifically to see her, even if admitting that directly would complicate situation. Both of them were pretending remained simple and transactional. "You're not here by accident," Gemma said when she reached the window, her observation delivered without accusation, but with certainty that indicated she'd developed some understanding of how he operated during the weeks since their crisis intersection. Her breath created small clouds in cold air, and she shifted her canvas bag higher on her shoulder, with movement that spoke of muscles trained to carry weight beyond what they should reasonably be expected to bear. Raphael conceded the point with slight nod, acknowledging what they both knew, without requiring verbal confession that would make his attention official, rather than something that could be dismissed as coincidental concern. He mentioned the business meeting in neutral tone that didn't quite achieve the casual effect he'd intended, and Gemma's mouth twitched with expression that wasn't quite smile, but suggested she appreciated the attempt at maintaining fiction of accidental encounter. "The rent payment was excessive," Gemma said, shifting topic to matter she'd clearly been processing, since discovering anonymous benefactor had eliminated her largest monthly expense for half a year. Her tone carried gratitude wrapped in discomfort about accepting help that went beyond restitution for stolen money and crossed into territory that felt like charity regardless of how the note had framed the transaction. "It was proportional to the disruption," Raphael replied, his response prepared because he'd anticipated this conversation would occur eventually and had constructed justification that was technically accurate even if it omitted the complete truth about his motivations. The men operated for 6 weeks before being stopped, and multiple families suffered extended period of fear and financial pressure that couldn't be adequately addressed with simple return of stolen funds. Gemma studied him through the open window with expression that suggested she was trying to reconcile the man who'd helped Nate with the reputation that preceded him into every interaction and defined how people responded to his presence. Her fingers tapped against her canvas bag in nervous patterns she caught and stopped, the gesture revealing internal debate about whether to push for honesty or accept the explanation that preserved dignity for both of them. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, after pause that lasted long enough to suggest she'd cycled through and discarded multiple other opening statements before settling on this one. "The text was inadequate for what you did, and I needed you to know that Nate talks about you like you're some kind of hero from his comic books, and I don't know how to explain to him the complexity of real life where good actions don't necessarily come from good people." The statement contained more honesty than Raphael had expected. Her willingness to acknowledge moral ambiguity, refreshing after decades of people pretending either that he was monster incapable of decent action or that his occasional kindness somehow erased the violence his organization required to maintain power. He appreciated the refusal to simplify him into category that made her comfortable at the expense of acknowledging uncomfortable reality about human capacity for contradiction. Gemma mentioned that she'd stood outside his restaurant the previous week, the admission emerging with embarrassed laugh that suggested she recognized the behavior was strange, but had done it anyway, because she needed to prove to herself she could approach his world even if she ultimately chose not to enter. The confession felt like gift, vulnerable enough that refusing to match it would constitute betrayal of the tentative connection they were building through conversations that happened in margins of their incompatible lives. "I know," Raphael said, his response gentle enough to remove sting of surveillance revelation, but direct enough to acknowledge he'd been aware of her presence, and her hesitation, and her eventual retreat. He explained that his security had alerted him to her standing outside, but he hadn't emerged because she clearly needed space to make decision without pressure that his presence would have added to already complicated internal negotiation. The school bell rang with harsh electronic tone that shattered the insulated bubble their conversation had created, and within seconds children began pouring through exits with energy that made the previous quiet seem impossible in retrospect. Gemma's attention divided immediately between Raphael and the crowd of students from which Nate would soon emerge, her maternal instincts overriding personal concerns because that's what parenthood required regardless of whatever else was happening in adult world. Nate appeared in the third wave of students, his backpack nearly as large as his torso and his jacket unzipped despite temperature that had most parents bundled in multiple layers. His face lit up when he spotted his mother, but the expression transformed into something brighter when his eyes continued scanning and found Raphael's vehicle parked where it shouldn't be, according to normal patterns of their separate existence. The child's excitement was visible even from this distance, his pace increasing to something between fast walk and forbidden running as he closed the gap between school exit and his mother's position beside the passenger window. Gemma's expression showed complicated mix of emotions watching her son react with such obvious joy to man whose presence in their lives probably should concern her more than it did given everything she knew about his profession. "Coffee," Raphael said, before Nate reached hearing distance, the single word containing invitation he hadn't planned to extend, but couldn't seem to prevent from emerging once the opportunity presented itself. "Not today," he clarified, recognizing she had shift starting soon and child requiring her attention. "But sometime when your schedule allows, and you want conversation that doesn't happen through car window in school parking lot." Gemma's eyes widened fractionally at the suggestion, surprise giving way to consideration as she processed offer that moved their interaction from crisis management into territory that looked suspiciously like deliberate relationship building. She opened her mouth to respond, but Nate arrived at that moment with momentum that nearly knocked her sideways, his greeting loud enough to attract attention from nearby parent clusters who were definitely noticing this interaction and would definitely discuss it after pickup concluded. The child's enthusiasm for seeing Raphael again was unfiltered by adult awareness of social complexity, and he immediately began asking questions about the restaurant and whether the bread was still as good, and if maybe they could visit again sometime. Gemma's hand on his shoulder applied gentle pressure that communicated need for volume control and social awareness, but her expression showed resignation to the fact that her son had formed attachment that wouldn't be easily redirected or dismissed. Raphael answered Nate's questions with patience that surprised Gemma based on everything she'd assumed about men in his position and their tolerance for children's unstructured enthusiasm. He offered that perhaps they could arrange visit when his mother's schedule permitted, the suggestion phrased to give Gemma veto power, while acknowledging Nate's desire for continuation of connection that had formed during crisis and persisted beyond its resolution. "Saturday afternoon," Gemma heard herself say, the words emerging before she'd fully processed the decision to accept invitation that represented step towards something she couldn't name, but couldn't seem to resist, despite all the rational objections her mind generated. "I have Saturday afternoon free before my night shift, and Nate has been asking about that bread for weeks, so maybe we could stop by if the offer's genuine and not just polite suggestion you're hoping we won't actually accept." Raphael's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, satisfaction flickering across his features before being replaced by careful neutrality that suggested he'd won something, but was experienced enough not to celebrate victory too obviously. He confirmed 3 o'clock would work perfectly, the specific time indicating he was already rearranging his schedule to ensure he'd be present, rather than leaving their visit to chance of coincidental timing that had brought them together today. Saturday arrived with unexpected sunshine that made December feel temporarily less hostile, temperature climbing high enough that Gemma could wear lighter coat without risking hypothermia during the walk from bus stop to restaurant. Nate had been awake since dawn with excitement that made breakfast impossible, and concentration on morning cartoons completely futile, his energy requiring multiple redirections to prevent him from wearing himself out before afternoon appointment arrived. They took the bus rather than accepting Raphael's offer of car service, Gemma's pride requiring that they arrive under their own power even if the journey took 90 minutes longer, and involved 2 transfers through neighborhoods that made her hyper-aware of her surroundings. Nate pressed his face against the window during the ride, narrating observations about buildings and people with running commentary that made other passengers smile despite themselves. Ristorante Luminosa looked different in afternoon light, less intimidating than it had during Nate's evening crisis visit, and more like establishment that regular people might enter for special occasions. The lunch rush had concluded, leaving dining room about 1/3 full with patrons who lingered over coffee and dessert, their conversations creating ambient noise that felt welcoming rather than oppressive like the silence of Nate's first visit. The maitre d' recognized them immediately, despite having no logical reason to remember one child among hundreds who must pass through his awareness during any given month, his greeting warm, and his escort to the same corner table Raphael had occupied during their first encounter, executed with efficiency, that suggested specific instructions had been provided about their expected arrival. The table had been set for 3 with attention to detail that included child-sized water glass and silverware positioned at Nate's place setting. Raphael rose when they approached, the gesture old-fashioned and unexpectedly courteous coming from man whose reputation suggested he dictated terms rather than observing social niceties designed to make others comfortable. He wore dark jeans and sweater rather than suit, the casual attire making him look younger and somehow more accessible despite his eyes maintaining the same alertness that had been present during their previous encounters. Nate slid into his chair with barely contained excitement, his eyes already scanning the menu that had appeared on the table as if by magic, though more likely through signal between Raphael and hovering waitstaff. The child's enthusiasm was infectious enough that Gemma felt some of her defensive tension easing, her shoulders dropping from the position they'd occupied since she'd made the decision to accept this invitation despite all her reservations. The bread arrived within minutes, still warm from the oven, and accompanied by olive oil that probably cost more per ounce than Gemma's grocery budget allowed for entire meals. Nate's face when he tasted the first piece showed pure joy uncomplicated by awareness of cost or social implications, and watching her son experience simple pleasure made Gemma's throat tight with emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. Conversation started awkwardly, because none of them had script for this situation that existed somewhere between gratitude visit and social engagement that might be evolving into something neither adult wanted to name. Raphael asked about Nate's school with genuine interest that suggested he actually cared about the answer rather than making polite small talk, and the child responded with detailed explanation of his favorite subjects and ongoing struggle with multiplication tables that his teacher insisted were important for future math success. Gemma found herself relaxing incrementally as the meal progressed through courses she hadn't ordered, but kept appearing with perfect timing and elegant presentation. The food was extraordinary, each dish demonstrating why critics praised this establishment even if they didn't know who owned it, but more remarkable was watching Raphael interact with Nate without condescension or impatience that many adults displayed toward children's circuitous storytelling style. The conversation shifted to Gemma's work when Nate finished his pasta, and became absorbed in dessert that involved chocolate in more forms than she'd realized were possible to combine in single dish. Raphael asked about oncology nursing with questions specific enough to indicate he'd either researched the specialty or knew someone who'd experienced cancer treatment, and understood the emotional toll the work extracted from people who chose to care for dying patients. She talked about her patients more than she'd intended, the words emerging in rush that suggested she'd been holding them in for lack of audience, who would understand without needing extensive explanation or offering platitudes about how hard her job must be. Raphael listened with focus that made her feel heard, in a way that was becoming addictive, his attention complete, and his responses indicating he understood the difference between sympathy and empathy. The afternoon stretched longer than Gemma had planned, the restaurant gradually filling with early dinner patrons while they remained at the corner table, as if time operated differently in their small bubble of conversation. Nate had fallen asleep against her side, despite claiming he wasn't tired, his body finally surrendering to excitement that had sustained him since dawn, and the sedating effect of full stomach after weeks of carefully rationed meals. Raphael watched the sleeping child with expression Gemma couldn't quite decode, something that looked like longing mixed with regret, though what he might be longing for or regretting she couldn't begin to guess. The moment felt suspended and fragile, weighted with possibility that terrified her precisely because it felt so natural when it should have felt impossible given everything about their circumstances and the gulf between their worlds. "I should go," Gemma said, the words breaking spell that had allowed them to exist in space outside normal rules, about who could be friends with whom, and what kinds of relationships were viable across class boundaries and moral frameworks that should be incompatible. She needed to get Nate home and herself to the hospital for shift that would anchor her in familiar reality, where attraction to dangerous men was recognized as problem to avoid rather than situation to explore. Raphael didn't argue or try to extend the afternoon further, understanding seemingly that pushing would destroy whatever was building between them more effectively than respecting her need to retreat and process before proceeding further. He arranged for his driver to take them home despite Gemma's protest, his insistence gentle but absolute because he wouldn't allow them to navigate buses and transfers with sleeping child when simple solution was available. The car ride passed in silence, comfortable enough that Gemma didn't feel pressure to fill it with unnecessary conversation. Nate stirring only when they pulled up outside their building, and cool air from open door reached him through his drowsy haze. Raphael had remained at the restaurant, his absence somehow more present than his physical proximity had been, and Gemma carried her sleeping son upstairs with muscles that burned from his growing weight, but heart that felt lighter than it had in years. Her phone buzzed while she was preparing for work. Message from now familiar number containing single sentence thanking her for the afternoon, and hoping she'd be willing to repeat the experience when her schedule allowed. Gemma typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on simple yes that contained multitudes of meaning she wasn't ready to articulate, but couldn't deny feeling. Despite all the rational objections her mind continued generating. She worked her shift with unusual distraction, her thoughts returning repeatedly to the afternoon in ways that interfered with her normal ability to compartmentalize personal life from professional responsibilities. Her coworkers noticed the difference, commenting that she seemed lighter somehow, and Gemma deflected their curiosity with vague references to good day off and quality time with her son that wasn't technically dishonest, even if it was incomplete. The week that followed brought 3 more text exchanges, brief conversations about nothing important that somehow felt significant, precisely because they served no practical purpose beyond maintaining connection. Neither of them seemed willing to sever. Raphael sent photo of bread from the restaurant with caption asking if Nate was requesting return visit, and Gemma responded with image of her son doing homework with tongue stuck out in concentration that made the child look simultaneously adorable and ridiculous. Their next meeting happened 2 weeks later at coffee shop in neutral territory, afternoon when Nate was at friend's house for playdate that gave Gemma rare hours of freedom from parental responsibility. The conversation flowed more easily than the restaurant lunch, perhaps because without the child as buffer, they could address directly the increasingly obvious attraction that was complicating what should have remained simple gratitude relationship. Raphael asked what she wanted from whatever was developing between them, the question direct enough to force honesty, but gentle enough to allow retreat if she needed it. Gemma admitted she didn't know how to want something that seemed fundamentally incompatible with life she'd built and values she'd been raised to uphold, but apparently logic had limited influence over feelings that had taken root, despite all the reasonable objections she kept marshalling against them. They agreed to take things slowly, whatever things meant in context, where slowly was probably still too fast given everything about their circumstances that should make any relationship impossible. But agreement felt important, even if neither could define exactly what they were agreeing to pursue, or how they would navigate the practical and moral complications that attending to attraction would inevitably create. 2 months transformed impossibility into improbable reality through accumulation of small moments that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively rewrote the boundaries Gemma had believed were fixed and immovable. Coffee meetings became weekly occurrence, then twice weekly, their conversations expanding beyond safe topics into territories that required vulnerability. Neither had expected to offer someone they'd known for such short time in objective measurement, but felt like much longer in emotional depth. Nate accompanied them sometimes, his presence providing both buffer and reminder of stakes involved in whatever relationship was forming between two adults whose lives had no logical intersection point. The child had absorbed Raphael into his world with uncomplicated acceptance that made the adult's careful navigation of complications seem almost silly. Nate's framework for categorizing people based on whether they were kind, rather than what they did for living that might complicate simple moral judgments. Raphael had begun appearing at unexpected moments, not in the stalker-adjacent way that would have triggered Gemma's carefully cultivated alarm systems, but in coincidences that felt engineered, but were offered with enough plausible deniability that she could accept them without feeling manipulated. He was at the grocery store when her car broke down in the parking lot, at the hospital cafeteria, when she took her break during particularly difficult shift, at Nate's school fundraiser, because apparently he'd made anonymous donation large enough to warrant invitation to the event. The careful distance they'd maintained began eroding through touches that lingered fractionally longer than necessary, eye contact that stretched past comfortable into charged territory that made Gemma's stomach flip, with sensations she'd forgotten were possible after years of exhaustion consuming energy that might have been directed toward romance. Neither addressed the shift explicitly, because naming it would require decisions about how to proceed, that neither felt ready to make despite momentum clearly pushing them toward inevitable conclusion. Gemma's co-workers had noticed the changes, even though she'd been careful not to discuss the developing relationship, her improved mood and occasional distracted smiles during shifts generating speculation about secret boyfriend that was simultaneously completely accurate and wildly off base regarding the actual situation. She deflected their curiosity with skill developed through years of protecting her private life from work scrutiny, but internal pressure of unacknowledged attraction was becoming difficult to sustain without resolution one direction or another. The turning point arrived during unseasonably warm February evening, when winter briefly relaxed its grip, and temperature climbed high enough that coats became optional rather than mandatory. Raphael had invited her to walk through park near the hospital after her shift ended, and Gemma had agreed, despite exhaustion that normally would have sent her directly home to collapse into sleep before Nate woke for school. The park was nearly empty at 11 at night, its paths lit by lamps that created pools of amber light separated by stretches of darkness that felt intimate rather than threatening. They walked in silence initially, the quiet comfortable enough that conversation felt optional rather than required to fill awkward void, and Gemma found herself hyper-aware of the space between them that kept shrinking incrementally with each step. Raphael stopped at bench overlooking pond, where ducks slept with heads tucked under wings, waiting until Gemma sat before joining her, with careful distance that respected boundaries that were becoming increasingly theoretical rather than actual barriers. He asked if she'd thought about what she wanted from situation that had evolved far beyond the gratitude relationship that had initially brought them together, his question gentle but requiring answer that couldn't be deflected or postponed indefinitely. Gemma admitted she'd thought about little else during the hours between their meetings, her brain cycling through all the reasons pursuing relationship with him was terrible idea, while her heart consistently overruled logical objections, with feelings she couldn't rationalize away through force of will. She explained her fear that getting involved with someone from his world would eventually require compromises she couldn't make, without betraying fundamental aspects of who she'd built herself to be through years of deliberate choices. But she also acknowledged the impossibility of ignoring attraction that had deepened through 2 months of conversations revealing person behind reputation, man capable of kindness that contradicted everything she'd been taught about people who operated outside legal boundaries, society established. Raphael listened without interruption, while she worked through tangled thoughts, giving her space to articulate confusion without rushing her toward conclusion that would resolve his uncertainty at cost of her processing time. He offered his own admission that relationship with her felt equally impossible from his perspective. The vulnerability required to care about someone outside his world representing security risk he'd spent years eliminating from his operational protocols. But apparently wisdom and discipline had limited influence over feelings that had developed, despite all the rational objections his experience had trained him to prioritize above emotional considerations that could become liabilities. The acknowledgement that they both felt the same complicated mix of attraction and impossibility created shift in the conversation, tension that had been building for weeks, finally finding release in honesty that made further pretense seem unnecessary. Gemma turned toward him on the bench, finding his eyes already focused on her with intensity that made her breath catch somewhere between lungs and throat. The kiss happened with inevitability that suggested it had been waiting for them to stop resisting long enough to allow it. Raphael's hand rising to cup her face with gentleness that contradicted the violence she knew those hands were capable of delivering when circumstances required. The contact was brief, almost chaste compared to what movies suggested kisses between adults should involve, but intensity behind it communicated volumes about desires that had been carefully controlled until this moment of permission. When they separated, Gemma felt simultaneously relieved and terrified about the line they'd just crossed that transformed theoretical attraction into actual relationship, requiring navigation of complications they'd been avoiding through careful distance. Raphael's thumb traced her cheekbone with touch, so light she almost questioned whether she'd imagined it, his eyes searching hers for confirmation that she didn't regret the decision to stop pretending their connection could remain platonic indefinitely. She didn't regret it, despite all the ways she probably should, and that realization felt simultaneously liberating and concerning, because it suggested her moral framework was more flexible than she'd believed when flexibility was theoretical, rather than applied to specific situation involving specific person who'd helped her son. They sat in continued silence after the kiss, processing implications of what had just occurred and what it would mean for carefully structured lives that were about to become significantly more complicated. Raphael walked her to the hospital parking lot where his driver waited to transport her home, propriety requiring they maintain certain appearances even as they acknowledged crossing into romantic territory that made such propriety seem almost quaint. He kissed her again at the car with less hesitation, but equal gentleness, his goodnight containing promise of continuation rather than closure of evening's vulnerability. Gemma rode home in state of emotional vertigo, her exhaustion forgotten in the flood of sensations and thoughts, demanding processing that would probably consume most of her supposedly restful sleep hours. She checked on Nate when she arrived, finding him deeply asleep with comic book open across his chest, and small smile suggesting pleasant dreams about heroes and adventures that simplified morality in ways adult life stubbornly refused to accommodate. The following weeks established new pattern where they no longer pretended to maintain purely platonic connection, their public interactions still carefully controlled but private moments, allowing expression of attraction that had been building since significantly earlier than either had been willing to admit. Gemma introduced the concept of Raphael as friend, who might become more to Nate with careful explanation that some relationships developed slowly and required time to understand fully before labels could be applied definitively. Their relationship progressed through stages that felt simultaneously too fast and too slow, each step forward requiring negotiation of how to maintain Gemma's independence while acknowledging genuine partnership developing between them. Raphael demonstrated respect for her autonomy that surprised her given stereotypes about controlling men in his profession, his support manifesting in ways that enhanced her life without attempting to reshape it according to his preferences or requirements. The moral complexity never fully resolved, because perhaps it couldn't be resolved cleanly when attraction crossed boundaries that society had established for historically valid reasons, even if individual circumstances suggested exceptions might exist. But Gemma found herself learning to live with ambiguity instead of demanding certainty, accepting that good people could do bad things, and bad people could do good things, and maybe the categories themselves were less useful than she'd been taught to believe. By spring, their relationship had achieved stability that neither would have predicted when Nate first grabbed Raphael's sleeve in desperate gamble that changed trajectory of 3 lives. They'd built something improbable but real, connection that transcended circumstances of their meeting, and proved that dignity and attraction could coexist in space between their separate worlds, where neither had to fully abandon their values to acknowledge what they'd found together. The restaurant where everything began became their place, in a way that transformed it from location of crisis into space, holding accumulated memories of conversations and meals and the gradual building of trust between people who started as helper and helped, but evolved into something more complex and more satisfying than either role alone could accommodate. Nate still ordered the bread, and Raphael still watched them both with expression that suggested he'd found something he hadn't known he was searching for, until 7-year-old had grabbed his sleeve and demanded he pay attention to suffering he had power to address. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments from which place you're watching this, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, as your support is important for me to continue here.